What's up, everybody? Matt Kajeski here, back again with the Stokastic DFS channel. And today we're talking college football DFS ahead of Saturday, week 8, the main slate, 13 games on DraftKings. We're going to break it all down for you. But before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We're also brought to you today by PrizePicks as the presenting sponsor. PrizePicks offers a variety of prop-based contests. You're making lineups with player props, overs, unders on the main stats of your choosing for all the major sports, and you can cross-reference them. You can use NBA with MLB, with college football, whatever it is you know. Lineups can be up to 5 players where you can 10 extra entry fee, and you're going to get 1 free month of Stokastic Plus Platinum when you click the link in the video description below. Go to PrizePicks, make your first deposit, and you're also going to get up to $100 in a match deposit bonus, so make sure to check out PrizePicks. All right, let's dive into the slate. We'll bring you behind the glass. This is our data usage tool where you can find everything you need to know about college football DFS. Up at the top, we have all sort of environmental factors. Seconds per play, that's basically pace and a ranking. Iowa being 98th. Teams pass rates, Iowa passing 50% of the time. Offensive line, defensive line matchups. Iowa's offensive line allowing 3.2 sacks. Defensive line generating 1.2. All your Vegas data and then how these defenses allow production. We've got the raw yardage per game and then the yards per attempt, so you can contextualize that. And this is our first game on the slate. We've got 13 up, 13 down. We're going to dive into this starting maybe not the most exciting game. It's Iowa taking on Ohio State. 30.5 point total, 30.5 point spread, in favor of Ohio State. Total is 49 points. Ohio State quickly taking more and more money. For DFS, clearly not the most exciting game. Iowa kind of gets your, all right, do I just X this game out or do I try to find a potential run back on this side? Their team total's not even 10 points. Can they keep it live enough to even target in DFS? If you do go this way, you're certainly not looking at Petrus. He's kind of in the category where you should get extra salary in your lineups to even roster Petrus. Not mobile, averaging 155 yards per game. If you were actually like adjusting price below the minimum, he'd be like a 3K quarterback, but DraftKings doesn't do that, so you X them out. 3-way timeshare at running back, you're not targeting that. Even the guys at the min. In the receiving game, you could maybe run back a Laporta. The guy had 16 targets last week. He's averaging 45 yards per game. He's only 3,400. He's got a 34% target share. You could do worse, but I mean, you can also do better than Laporta. So I don't love it. Their wide receiver 1, Nico Reganey, he's now back from injury. He's 3,300, 10 targets last week. He's averaging 5.3 over the last 4. That's kind of cut into Arlen Bruce. It's basically just Laporta or Reganey. Otherwise, you're moving on. Keegan Johnson's still allegedly not healthy. I wouldn't expect to see him here. On the other side, Ohio State, they're slow and they're pretty run-heavy, 44% pass rate, but they're so explosive that it hasn't really mattered for DFS. The one thing that's happened is that depressed pass rate has affected Stroud from a ceiling perspective. He's only averaging 289 yards per game on 26 attempts. I use that word only pretty cautiously here. If any team even keeps pace with Ohio State or remotely close, he's going to soar over these attempt numbers. And his efficiency has been incredible this year, same as last year. He's not mobile, or at least he chooses not to be mobile, so he is somewhat dependent on this rushing upside, or excuse me, this passing upside. But we know Stroud is so explosive with his pass catchers that he could pop off for an enormous ceiling at any point. He's got to be in your tournament pool regardless. Cash, I'm probably looking a different way. Running back, both Trevion Henderson and Mayan Williams have missed games in their last 2, and that's led to a lot of opportunities for Dallin Hayden. Both are expected back here. When they're both healthy, it's like a 50-50 timeshare with a slight balance towards Henderson. With the health unknown of these guys, they're kind of just explosive GPP plays at their prices. You're going to find more volume at cheaper prices is the bottom line. In the receiving room, we're also expected to see Jackson Smith-Njigba back. He's barely played this year. He has just 5 targets. Hamstring injury very early in the year. Their coaches have been optimistic with him for weeks now. They are coming off a bye, so I think there's a better chance he plays here. And with how cautious they've been, they probably don't have a lot of restrictions on him. I think he comes back to a full-time role, which in my opinion should make their 3 wide receiver sets Jackson Smith-Njigba 1, Emeka Egbuka 2, and Marvin Harrison 3. Now, whatever order you want to rank them, I think you can make debates one way or the other. But I'm going to try to get to pieces of all three in lineups and in CJ Stroud stacks. Even though they're expensive, there's enough value to do so. Double stacks probably off the table unless you include tight end Stover, who is live. I mean, he's averaging 4.3 targets per game over the last 4 games. That's great for the Stone minimum. You rarely find an attachment to Ohio State at the Stone minimum. I actually like that approach. But all this to say, I think this brings Jalen Fleming off the field more. Maybe he rotates in with JSN. We don't know how active he'll be in his first game back, but something to monitor. You guys already know this. It's hard to poke holes in Ohio State. You play them when you can. Game 2, Syracuse-Clemson. Not the most stackable game. 49.5 total. Pretty close to Ohio State's. 13.5 point spread in favor of Clemson. That gives them a pretty usable 31.5 implied team total. Syracuse sitting at 18. He may be surprised. You know, it's a team with a undefeated record. But Syracuse is a bit tricky to evaluate because of their easy schedule. They're 90th in pace, 44% pass rate. They have the old Virginia OC, Robert Anai. They've shown a preference towards playing fast in certain games and slow in others. So I'm curious what we see. Schrader's been awesome under the new OC. Really efficient, 240 passing yards per game. He has 300 rushing yards. It's basically 50 yards on the dot per game on the ground. That's usable regardless of matchup. The matchup here definitely is going to depress his ceiling. Got a fully healthy Clemson defensive line on the other side, but Schrader's at least in your GPP conversation. The best play on this Syracuse team is still Sean Tucker. Really cheap here. The only issue is like Schrader cannibalizes him a lot. Last game, Schrader had 12 designed rush attempts. That sucked Tucker all the way down to 14. So unlike last year when Tucker was basically getting 25 plus carries a game, Schrader's cannibalizing him at times. Tucker's still really active in the pass game. Second most targets on the team. Third most receiving yards. I think he's playable at this price, but he's more fair, I think, in terms of matchup than he would have been last year. In the pass game, I think Oronde Gadsden's overpriced, even though he's been really efficient this year. 84.5 yards per game on 6.2 targets. That's risen to 7.8 in the last 4. But you're really making an opportunity cost decision with him. And then from there, they rotate a lot of receivers. I would probably go to Damian Alford or Trevor Pina behind them, but don't feel great about anybody. Last time they played, outside of Tucker and Gadsden, no one had more than 3 targets, and you're rarely seeing people eclipse 5, so tough spot. Clemson, big team total here, average in terms of pass rate and in terms of pace. DJ Uiagalelei has been awesome this year. Not something I would expect myself to be saying, but he's averaging 238 passing yards on 30 attempts per game. He has 337 rushing yards. You know, that's around 50 per game. Really good designed rushing numbers in the last 4 games, counts of 9, 15, 8, and 13. Those are awesome rushing numbers on designed attempts for a quarterback. That's not even what he gives you as a scrambler. He's firmly in play. I hesitate with cash, but he's definitely a GPP viable quarterback at this total. Will Shipley is also taking on a larger role. Kobe Pace is out. He'll be out for a while, sprained ankle. But Shipley, 20 carries last game. When the going's tough for Clemson, they'll ride him more. When it's not, they'll put Phil Maffa in the game. Shipley also had 6 targets last game for a total of 26 touches. He's a monster when he gets the full workload. Think you could use him for sure. In the pass game, it's a bit of a rotation for Clemson. My favorite play is still Antonio Williams, but his prices come way up here. Long gone are the days where we could get him at the Stone Min. 4 targets per game, still probably not enough, but he's their leading receiver, their most explosive receiver. He needs to play more for this team, and I think he will down the stretch. Otherwise, it's Bo Collin, Joseph Nada, and maybe a Davis Allen tight end play, but we're getting pretty thin here with the pass catchers. Nobody averaging more than 4.6 targets per game. These are just raw GPP plays, and my favorite would be Williams. He's kind of poorly price adjusted. Kansas taking on Baylor. First game with a pretty good total, 58 points, 9.5 points spread in favor of Baylor. Kansas is slow. They're run heavy, but they've been explosive, and they're on their backup quarterback now, Jason Bean. They haven't dropped off that much with Bean, I must say. I'm a little surprised because we saw him last year. Wasn't the most efficient, but Bean has been good. Small sample, so we'll see how he progresses. But overall, 94 rushing yards, the better part of that coming in the last 2 games. Pretty efficient as a passer. He's been around 250 in each of the last 2. I don't have the figures in front of me, but well over 200 yards in each of those starts. And designed rush attempts are pretty good. 10 designed rush attempts in those 2 games. I think he's GPP viable. What it comes down to with Bean for me is he's just a little too expensive compared to some of the other guys on this slate. And then given his team total, Baylor is no slouch on defense either. So being in a kind of a tough spot here, especially with Baylor's strength up front on defense. The receiving room, Luke Grimm saw his routes cut in half almost essentially last week. That was a big surprise to me. I'll pull up the exact figures, but Lawrence Arnold was still the number one for this team. Not necessarily in terms of targets. He hasn't been there all year, but routes, he's been over 80% in each of the last 3 games. Luke Grimm dropped from 73% route share to 44%. That came with Quentin Skinner jumping up to 77%. Could this be a changing of the guard? Skinner only saw 1 target. He's more of a burner, but it's at least worth considering. I think this team is going to rotate regardless. Like Arnold, he's the only guy playing 90-ish% of the routes. Grimm has been rotating the whole season, so I wouldn't expect this to change too much. The only other playmaker worth talking about is Mason Fairchild. He has 9 targets in the last 2 games, but that's pretty rare for him. Only 16 on the year. For tournaments, I would focus mainly on Skinner and Arnold, but maybe a really contrarian Grimm. That's pretty thin, though. On Baylor, Blake Shapen dealing with a head injury. They played on Thursday last week, so he's got extra time to rest, and everyone's expecting him to play. Shapen's been awesome over the last couple games. Efficiency on the rise, 241 passing yards per game on 27 attempts. Not really mobile, 32 yards there. The only thing I'll say is like his really good games have come against really suspect competition. Like West Virginia ranks 126th in coverage. That's definitely plays a role in Shapen balling out. This secondary is a little better, but Kansas still allowing 8.4 yards per attempt. I think fully healthy Shapen, he's probably looking at another efficient performance, but is that enough? The offense is slow. They still prefer the run. This is a game manager role he's playing. I have questions. I think he's a little expensive, and I know it seems like I don't like a lot of quarterbacks outside of Stroud and Uiagalelei right now. We've got some really good matchups later in the slate. The backfield, Craig, otherwise known as Squirrel Williams, was injured in their last game. That's sort of consolidated opportunity to Richard Reese and Quaylen Jones. They're playing vastly different roles. Reese is just a grinder. Quaylen's their pass-catching back. It's tough to play either of them at this point. Reese was on a strong trajectory, but he's now seen decreasing opportunity in each of the last 2 games. I'll probably avoid, but it's tough. They're big favorites. In the receiving game, we saw Gavin Holmes pop off for a monster game after we saw Monterey Baldwin pop off for his. These are the top 2 receivers with Hal Presley actually functioning in as the 3. Ben Sims, the tight end, also involved. At this point, the best price-adjusted play is probably Gavin Holmes, but we're still talking about like really thin volume for all these guys. Ben Sims averages the most targets per game at 5.6. Then Presley, 3.8. Gavin Holmes, 3.7. Monterey, 3.6. I mean, these are really dicey GPP options for tournaments, especially Baldwin at 7.5K. He's just not playable at that price. It's Gavin Holmes, Presley, or Ben Sims, or bust, and most likely I'll be looking elsewhere. Cincinnati SMU, 3-point spread in favor of Cincinnati. I think this goes to 3.5. 58.5 total. That's been descending because of the injuries. Both teams are fast. Cincinnati 45th in pace, SMU second. Both teams pass heavy. Cincinnati 52% pass rate, SMU 58. Ben Bryant's hurt, left their most recent game, has now had to bye in between, but no update on his status. All we heard was their coaching staff say they were hopeful that he'll play. So not exactly the best endorsement, but not bad either. Ben Bryant, 262 yards per game on 31 attempts, non-mobile, negative 39 yards on the ground. So he needs to rely on his arm. Fortunately, SMU's been gashed by opposing passing attacks. 8.4 yards per attempt allowed. Ben Bryant's going to be a solid play if active. Probably tournaments more, but still like him. Their backup, Evan Prater, is noteworthy. He's the highest recruit in program history. Different skill set than Bryant's. Very mobile, so I'm not sure he's out of play either at 6,500. And what he gives you through the air would be a bonus. In the backfield, we had Corey Kiner miss their last game. He's expected back here. That should form a committee with Charles McClelland. And I think those are the main 2 backs. We haven't seen Miles Montgomery or Ryan Montgomery much recently. It's kind of just been a 2-way committee. And the last game where they were both healthy, McClelland 13 carries, Kiner 12. Kind of seeing it that way. For what it's worth, McClelland is the much better pass-catching back. He has 17 targets on the year, so still a preference towards McClelland, albeit slightly. SMU allows 5 yards per rush attempt, so these are good GPP plays. In the pass game, Tyler Scott also banged up in their last game alongside Ben Bryant. Again, same words here. Hopeful that he plays. He's averaging a ton of targets per game, and he's averaging 84 receiving yards. So he's an awesome play if he gets out there. Not the most voluminous role, but efficiency definitely there. If he misses, Trey Tucker is going to be a much better play. 9 targets in his absence, 6.8 targets per game, 66 yards. He is very solid for this team. And then I'm going to defer to the routes for the last guys to talk about here, just because it's been volatile to start. They do use a lot of tight ends. Josh Wiley saw his route share jump to 73%. Leonard Taylor's dropped a little bit, and that's noteworthy because these guys don't play a lot on the field together. They've reduced their 12 personnel. What really happened was Nick Mardner saw his routes jump from 34% up to 58%, and then Jaden Thompson jumped up to 65%. Jaden Thompson, 3 targets. Nick Mardner, 3 targets. I think these guys split the wide receiver 3. I think the preference is probably Mardner, just more active throughout the year, more targets, cheaper price. But you could also go to tight end Wiley. He saw a lot more routes to nearly 70%. Still probably trying to get to Tucker if I can, but wouldn't hate a contrarian Wiley or Mardner. This is a great game environment, and a lot of people just ignore Cincinnati pass catchers because they're tough to deal with. SMU, really high pass rate, really fast. They're playing a tough matchup against Cincinnati's D, and Mordecai does have a lot of banged up pass catchers, but the offense has propelled him to fantasy success this far. 334 passing yards on 39.5 attempts. He is mobile, 86 yards on the ground. Not like crazy mobility, but he's not taking zeros. Mordecai is a good play, just not quite as strong price adjusted as he has been on other slates, given the tough matchup and the lower team total he has. The backfield's a mess. Both Trey Siggers and Velton Gardner didn't play in their last game. Watch them pregame. It's a 50-50 timeshare. At least it has been lately when they're both out there. Siggers has the edge on the year, 17 touches per game to 11 for Gardner. But Gardner's out-touched him in the last game. I think it was Navy they faced, so they're just keeping their guys healthy. They also took Rashee Rice out of the game. We now know why. He's apparently dealing with a pretty severe toe injury. And one beat reporter called him week to week. Another one came back right at him and said he's been week to week all year and he plays every single week. So it sounds like this isn't a new injury for Rice. The latter beat reporter did say he expects Rice to play. If Rice is playing it in a competitive game, he averages 13.5 targets per game. That number was up by like 15 until last week's game where he only saw 5 targets. And again, what happened there was they played Navy, they killed him, they just took him out of the game. And then Navy backdoored SMU and I lost my bet. But that's not here or there. This is a DFS show. With Rice banged up, it's at least worth monitoring. They also lost Bo Corrales for the year, a week after they lost Jake Bailey for the year. So who fills the void? Dylan Goffney has played a lot recently. His route rate is up around 70% the last 2 weeks. 4 targets. He's the Stoneman. He's certainly viable. He's probably the best Stoneman play on the slate. And from there, you're going to see a rotation at the last receiver between Moochie Dixon, otherwise known as Kelvonte. Austin Upshaw has seen a decreasing role. And I think that's because we got Roderick Daniels back, who had a pretty good route rate around 30% in his first game since he almost left the program to transfer. But he's back. He's playing. They also have tight end RJ Maryland, but his route rate has dropped a lot recently too. To rank them, number 1's Rice. If he's out, I would go immediately down to Dylan Goffney. From there, it's tentatively Moochie Dixon, Austin Upshaw, and then Roderick Daniels for me. UNLV, Notre Dame. Okay, 27-point spread in favor of Notre Dame, who just dropped the game to Stanford in a game with a 47 total. That puts UNLV's total right around 10 points. Their starting quarterback's hurt. He's dealing with a head injury. Still doesn't return to practice. Doesn't mean he can't get cleared in time for the game, but it's seeming unlikely at this point. Brumfeld's still probably not playable, whether he's out there or not. Just a really bad game environment. Slow teams. Notre Dame's strength is defense, and Brumfield hasn't played in a while. If you don't have Brumfield, they're going to rotate Cameron Friel and Harrison Bailey. Can't play any of them. Aiden Robbins is hurt too. He's their bell cow back. He's not practicing either. When he was out, they just did 50-50 timeshare between Courtney Reese and Jordan Young-Humphrey. Don't want to target a timeshare in a matchup against Notre Dame, but Young-Humphrey is 3.2K for you GPP deep divers. In the receiving room, Ricky White's been the alpha, but man, this quarterback room without Brumfield is really tough to trust. Kind of just renders them all unplayable, but Kyle Williams is practicing again. That means he should probably return soon. They're the 2 best receivers on the team. And then I think Seneca McKee would be the 3, but holy smokes, this team went really run heavy without him. They barely got any plays off last week. I'm just not going to touch UNLV. Notre Dame, I mean, okay. I don't want to play Notre Dame as much as you guys don't want to play Notre Dame. But they have a 37 team total. So we probably got to talk about these guys. Drew Pine is a game manager. When Notre Dame gets up in games, like they're just going to take the ball out of his hands. So I wouldn't expect a ceiling performance from him. He is 5K, so it's at least worth talking about. Maybe in the biggest of GPPs, but Pine's pure game manager status. They're going to run the ball a ton. Unfortunately, they use a three-way committee. The one thing I'll say here is Logan Diggs has quietly moved ahead of some of these other backs in the pecking order. Diggs led the team in snaps, routes, carries, and he saw a target last week. Diggs is 4K flat. He's the guy I'm going to throw a dart on. Otherwise, you have Audric Estime, who has a really good role too. He's just not really as involved in the pass game. He's also more expensive. He's been the most explosive, though, for what it's worth. Diggs just coming in a little behind him. Chris Tyree's been pretty disappointing, but he's also the most expensive. So I like Diggs and Estime more than Tyree if you're getting there. When they do throw Michael Mayers, the locked-in target getter, 35.5% target share, 68 yards per game. He's 5K, which is appropriate in price. From there, you've got Lorenzo Styles, Braden Lenzy, and Jaden Thomas as the top three receivers. I'm not going to play any of these guys more than likely. They essentially play every snap, but really a low upside. The best one has been Styles, 45.5, nearly 46 yards per game. Nobody else on the team outside of Jaden Thomas is 100 yards receiving on the year, and Thomas is at 114. West Virginia, Texas Tech. Now we're getting to the good games. 65.5 total, 6.5 point spread in favor of Texas Tech. Both teams fast, both teams pass heavy. Let's go. JT Daniels, maybe not. 7,100 for him on DraftKings. He is a pocket statue, negative 37 rushing yards. He's not efficient either. 249 yards per game on 36 attempts. That's pretty middling overall for Daniels. Just not living up to his expectations as former Georgian USC signal caller. I think on a slate this big with his price, you're probably looking elsewhere, but he's tournament viable. The backfield is a mess. CJ Donaldson might return here. The last time he played a full game, he outcarried Justin Johnson 23-11, outcarried Tony Mathis 23-8 in that span. It's going to be a timeshare regardless, but Donaldson should lead the way. And then you've got Justin Johnson and Tony Mathis taking what's left, making it a three-way timeshare, which isn't great, but Donaldson is the most efficient. In the receiving game, they use 3 wide on every play and often mixing in 4 wide. Bryce Ford-Wheaton leads the team with 65 targets. It's 29% target share. He's recently ceded quite a bit of work to Caden Prather, who is clearly the wide receiver 2 at this point. I think on the year, you've got, so far, Bryce Ford-Wheaton 11 targets per game. Prather 8.3. Yardage favors Wheaton slightly too, but that's just in line right with his targets. Prather's the better price adjusted play. He averages more targets than Bryce Ford-Wheaton over their last 4 games, 5,800. I'll be playing some Prather. Sam James would just be your contrarian pivot off Prather. He did have a 13-target game in their second most recent contest, but he hasn't seen more than 5 in any of the other 3 games mixed in around there. Lastly, they lost Michael Laughlin. They don't run a tight end on the majority of their plays anyway, so Reese Smith's the wide receiver 4 when he's out there. He'll split times with Brian Palendi. Not interested in those ancillary guys. Texas Tech's tricky. 4th in pace, 61% pass rate. They're facing one of the worst pass defenses in the country. 9.7 yards per pass attempt allowed, 126th in coverage. But who starts? Tyler Show has been out since week 1. Donovan Smith allegedly got hurt. So they started Baron Morton against TCU. Played really well, but then they put Donovan Smith out there at receiver. Like if Donovan Smith was really hurt enough to not start at quarterback, why did he play receiver? I don't know. Those are questions for the staff. But Baron Morton played really well in his first start. Over 300 yards passing, over 50 yards on the ground, multiple scores against TCU. He got banged up himself, so there were questions about whether he'd play in this game, but he's been taking most of the first team reps this week. He's still volatile. He's only played 1 game, but the majority of 1 game, I should say. But Baron Morton's enough. There's enough upside here for tournaments based on the efficiency he showed and the offense he plays in, which again is really fast and really pass heavy. Volume's always going to benefit the Texas Tech signal caller. And it looks like Baron Morton for now. You might see multiple guys play, but I'm going to be looking at Morton. At running back, so Roderick Thompson outcarried Taj Brooks 17-4. That was unforeseen. I haven't seen any injury news on Brooks, so I don't know why this happened. Roderick also had 3 targets in the pass game, which is a bit abnormal for him. So tentatively, I think he may have worked ahead of Brooks. If anything, he's just like a raw, better price-adjusted play for those of you looking at the backfield. I'm not looking at it a ton, but Roderick at least piqued my interest. In the receiving game, 2 key injuries to monitor: Miles Price and J.J. Sparkman. Both missed the last game. Both are questionable. No idea what happens, but their absence really propelled 3 guys forward. Jaron Bradley, 9 targets. Trey Cleveland, 16 targets. Xavier White, 8 targets. Now, as far as routes go, Jaron Bradley really dominated this aspect of the game. 88% routes. Trey Cleveland, 71%. Xavier White, 57%. And then the last person to mention, Roderick, again, 81% of the routes. My goodness, he was really involved. But behind them, Nehemiah Martinez, 37%. You had Luis Fungi, 13%. I'm not expecting these guys to be involved, whether they return or not. And if Price and Sparkman are out, that should keep routes pretty condensed for Bradley, Cleveland, and White. If these guys return, Price was formerly their wide receiver 1. I think he hurts Bradley a lot. And then J.J. Sparkman's been all over the map with routes. I don't even know if he affects anybody, but best price-adjusted plays for me, number 1, Bradley. 2, Price if he plays. 3 would be Cleveland. Texas, Oklahoma State, 61 total, very good. 6.5 point spread in favor of Texas. Both teams fast. Texas relatively fast, I should say. 57th in pace, 45.5% pass rate. Queen of Yours has been really efficient. He just hasn't gotten a ton of volume off. So we still haven't seen like an eruption game from Ewers. We also haven't seen him run a lot. -5 yards on the ground. He only has 5 carries, and 3 of them, or one of them is a sack, I guess. Ewers is a unknown low sample size dart throw in tournaments right now. In shootouts, he's going to get to 300 yards in some games. Otherwise, the offense is so many playmakers. Sometimes it just flows through Bijan. That's the way Texas is going to be. They're really efficient both through the air and on the ground, so it's not always going to be Ewers leading the way, making him a little dicey. But tournaments, this Oklahoma State defense has gotten through the air before. Now, who do you throw him with? It's probably Xavier Worthy, Jordan Whittington, or Jatavian Sanders, all at differing price points. Worthy's your alpha, so he's the number 1 you're getting to, 7.7 targets per game. Jatavian Sanders has quietly been really good at tight end. He's at least 5 targets in 3 straight games, and he just doesn't see his price move. Explosive, too. Touchdown upsides there. Sanders a great dart. And then Whittington's kind of your GPP slot receiver. His routes were fine. Don't worry about the 2 targets last week. He'll have bigger games. In the backfield, Bijan, my goodness, this guy is awesome. I'm sure a lot of you guys saw the highlights of that. Like, he didn't quite lay out, but he really extended for a catch. Deep downfield, too, running like crazy routes for a running back. This guy's awesome. He has 20 targets on the year, 4 targets last week, 32 touches, over 100 yards rushing per game, over 30 receiving yards per game. Bijan, the only knock on him is price. You're going to find players with similar touch volume at cheaper prices, but if you've got extra salary, Bijan, he rules. For Oklahoma State, Spencer Sanders is banged up, throwing shoulder injury. Coaches have been really quiet on his status. They did the same last week, and he played, had his worst game of the year, 44% completion percentage, but he still ran for 2 scores, over 200 yards passing. He should, even if you get 90% Sanders, like he's still probably a pretty good play, especially like in a shootout matchup. Texas plays solid defense, so that's a concern for sure, but Sanders, his mobility keeps him live everywhere, 300 yards on the ground this year. If he sits, expect Oklahoma State to start former walk-on and son of the coach Gunnar Gundy, who looks, I guess, kind of mobile himself, 47 yards on a really limited sample. But this guy, we have no idea what he is. He's a walk-on. I'm not real optimistic. I'll probably bet Texas if Sanders is out. Dominic Richardson's a bell cow. He hasn't quite gotten to that like ceiling game yet, but he still had 22 carries last week, 3 targets, 25 overall touches. This guy is a touch monster. They're not involving anybody else. So no, the efficiency hasn't been there. Just 72 yards on the ground. Does have 34.7 in the air. That's really good per game. So you can still play Richardson. He's got really high touch upside, just tough matchup. In the receiving room, Jaden Bray re-hurt his hand. So I don't think he plays. That's an injury he already had. So if he's out, I think receiving core is pretty clear. It's Braden Johnson, Bryson Green, top 2 route getters. Brennan Presley, he doesn't run as many routes, but he's targeted more than Bryson Green for sure. And then John Paul Richardson rounds things out. All of them are viable. I think if you're going to the high end, it's Braden Johnson, just more efficient through the air, more targets. If you're paying down, it's probably Bryson Green, but John Paul Richardson had 7 targets last week. I mean, all 4 of these guys are viable, and I'd be trying to mix and match in stacks. But again, the whole team rides on the status of Spencer Sanders. Mississippi LSU. This total is taking money, opened around 66, up to 68. It's going to be played at the speed of light. This is why I wasn't too into the quarterbacks at the beginning. Now we're into the meat of the slate. Ole Miss, a 2-point dog here after opening as a favorite, 68 total. Jackson Dart gets his first real test of the year. He's been hypermobile, 371 rushing yards. Ole Miss is only passing 35% of the time, but they run so many plays that Dart still averages over 200 yards as a passer. He's a great GPP option here. If anything, this game is going to coax him into maybe a more pass-heavy environment. And if not, he's got the mobility to lean back on. Here are the rushing attempts from last week's game. Quinshon Judkins, 24. Zach Evans, 21. Dart, 16 designed attempts. Doesn't even include him as a scrambler. This team is ridiculous on the ground. Now, Judkins, Evans, it's going to be a 50-50 timeshare. Evans dealt with a hip pointer earlier in the year. That opened the door for Judkins to play into a role, and boy, has he. These two are both hyper efficient. Great GPP options. It's similar to like the Tennessee backs on a given week where they run so many raw plays that there's times where like one or both of them just going to pop off. It's similar to North Carolina when they had Javonte Williams and Michael Carter. It's that kind of offense. Now, tough matchup here. They're underdogs, but those kind of plays are always live, like Evans and Judkins for tournaments. With the injury to Jalen Robinson, they've really condensed their routes to 3 guys. It's Jonathan Mingo, Malik Heath, and Jordan Watkins. Not the highest volume passing attack, but Mingo leads the team easily with 507 yards. That's just over 70 per game. He's slightly out-targeted Heath, so he's been more efficient too. But Watkins quietly has at least 4 targets in 4 straight games, and he's 4K flat. Now, you can play Watkins as a cheaper option in this price range as well. The team lost Michael Trigg. That's a concern for them, but they're basically using Casey Kelly as a 1-for-1 option. He's just a non-athletic, like, tight end filler out there. I'd be just trying to get up to Jordan Watkins if that's where you are. Jaden Daniels looks like an awesome play on paper. He's the team's leading rusher. He's absurd. He already has 37 scrambles, and he gets a ton of designed attempts. He came off that injury a few weeks ago. Then his designed attempts have slowly risen, 5 to 6 to 13 last week. This guy's a monster on the ground, and they've also been passing more, 223 yards, 30 attempts per game. Daniels a rock-solid play, cash viable if you want to go there. High total, they're favored. Back and forth affair on the docket. Love Daniels. They've also kind of condensed their backfield to just Josh Williams and John Emery. I think going forward, it's like a 60-40 split between them. It was pretty close last week. 16 touches for Williams, 14 for Emery. The efficiency is pretty similar, honestly, between them. So it's hard to break the tie. Williams is the stone min. That's where I'll break it. You want a really cheap play, Williams is live. In the passing game, Brian Thomas, he's been playing limited snaps, but he caught the touchdown. I think we start this with Beck. I'm not sure he plays. He re-injured his lower back was what it was called. Apparently he's got some tightness there. I don't know. I don't think he plays. So what does that do to routes? Well, the top 2 route getters are going to be Malik Neighbors and Kayshon Boutte, 77% of the routes for Neighbors last week, 83 for Boutte. The third most active route getter was Mason Taylor, their tight end, and people still ignoring Mason Taylor. He's 3rd on the team in targets, 3rd on the team in routes. I mean, he's just basically catching the ball at the line of scrimmage and falling down, so there's not a lot of upside. As you can see, he's their 5th leading receiver, but it's a lot of target volume for the tight end. Behind these guys, you had Jerry Jenkins, 51% route rate, Brian Thomas, 49%, so really close there. And then, your Kyron Lacey at 20%. It's a bit of a rotation, but up at the top, I think you can play some Neighbors and Boutte at the middling prices. Otherwise, probably just Brian Thomas or Taylor down below 4K. UCLA, Oregon, man, these afternoon games, this late slate, just so sick for totals. 72.5 points, 6-point spread in favor of Oregon. Both teams pretty fast, more so on the UCLA side. Balanced in terms of pass to run rate. DTR is having the career season we've been wanting for him for a while. 7,900, it's too cheap. He's cash viable. 27.5 attempts per game, 250 yards. If he's coaxed into one of these elite game environments, you're going to see his ceiling. 231 yards for DTR. Designed attempts are there. He's just a rock solid play. Charbonnet, I think, is probably the best running back play on the slate in a vacuum based on price, not in a vacuum. In a vacuum is probably Bijan or Braylon, who we'll talk about. But Charbonnet, price adjusted, my goodness, this guy is incredibly involved in the offense. Really good pass game role, 22 carries in back-to-back games, really efficient, 123 yards on the ground. Charbonnet is a rock-solid back against Oregon, who's been a little leaky against the run. In the receiving room, it's basically Jake Bobo and now Cam Brown. Cam Brown has quietly taken on a much larger role. He's 3,900, hasn't really reflected in targets, but he's moved ahead of Kazmeir Allen in terms of routes, and it's been a consistent trend here. So I think moving forward, sooner rather than later, you see bigger games for Cam Brown. Last week, Kazmeir Allen, 48% routes. Jake Bobo, 88%. That's normal. Cam Brown, 72%. And then we saw Kazmeir at 48% with Logan Loya kind of splitting that wide receiver 3. One interesting thing here, tight end Michael Ezeki, 72% route rate. He moved well ahead of Hudson Habermel, who had previously been the tight end when Ezeki was hurt. That's at least something to watch. The tight end role for this team has been good in the past. Saw Dulcich play it. Not the most targets yet, but he's 3,300, at least worth saying. On the other side, Bo Nix. Man, has this team been efficient. Bo Nix, you know what you're getting. The volatile play, his interception rate's really high, but he's averaging 254 yards per game on 31 attempts. Awesome career numbers for Bo Nix. Really mobile too. 331 yards. This guy's only taken 1 sack all season. Who is this Bo Nix? But 9,300 is a lot to pay for him is the last thing I'll say. I would rather play DTR straight up, but I got to give Bo Nix credit where it's due. He's been sick in the backfield. Man, if they could just consolidate opportunity to Bucky Irving, Marquise Irving, you may know him as, that would be so sick. He averages 11.3 touches per game. He's over 70 rushing yards per game at this really low touch volume. Man, if they ever consolidated, he would be great, but it's hard to trust a 4-back committee. It's Irving, Whittington, Jordan James, and Sean Dollars all involved. And Byron Cardwell hasn't even returned. We'll see when that happens. Tough to get to. In the receiving room, it's basically Troy Franklin and Chase Cota as the main receivers. Troy Franklin up at 71.5 yards per game. You've got Cota at 46.5. He's the UCLA transfer. This is another team that rotates routes, which makes it pretty difficult to get to some of these guys. Like, for example, behind the main players, you've got a 61% route rate for Hudson last week. That's pretty new for him. You're typically not seeing that. He was at 43% the week before. You know, like, I think it's just worth it. 7 McGee was at 32%. It's kind of number 1 Franklin, number 2 Cota, 3 Hudson tentatively, but I don't feel good about that. Tight end's a nasty 4-way rotation. You're ignoring that entirely. Boston College, Wake Forest, 61 total, another good one. Huge spread here too, 20.5 points in favor of Wake. So BC, not the best spot. Jurkovic not running at all anymore. Huge problem. Volume's there, efficiency's not. 222.5 passing yards per game. 5.6K, I mean, the matchup's not terrible. It's kind of one of the lone shootout environments he'll see all year. Just, man, that team is bad. Their offensive line is atrocious. 3.8 sacks per game. That's contributing to the negative rushing yards for Jurkovic. They're also super banged up in the backfield. Alex Broom and Cam Barfield missed their last game. Those two play a lot when they're healthy, especially Broom. He really came on strong before the injury. Pat Garwo's in a pure timeshare now. I don't think you can play any of them. The one guy you're probably looking at is Zay Flowers, 10.7 targets per game, 93 yards per game. He can do it on his own. Sick player there. Jaden Williams and Jalen Gale are the wide receiver 2 and 3. I would rather just pay up for Flowers than get to those guys. George Takix from Notre Dame missed their last game. You'll have to watch his status too. That could affect things down the line here, but BC, it's kind of just Zay Flowers or bust for me. Wake Forest and Sam Hartman, this team, fast, 12th in pace, 46% pass rate, so they're willing to ride the run. And in their second most recent game, we saw 18 carries for Ellison, 20 for Turner. That could be the kind of game we get here if they're just rolling. So this is a more volatile team than last year. Last year was basically stack the pass catchers, ignore the running backs. This year, we've got to at least 10 to the running backs a little bit. Turner at 5K flat is a really good price for him. He's also the preferred pass catcher of the two, not by much, but it's at least worth mentioning. In the receiving room, I want to go to the routes because this team is consistently rotated. It's not always been the most consistent. I think we can say with confidence A.T. Perry's the one, but what happens beyond him? Donovan Green, if you just look at the routes on the year, it's A.T. Perry 71%, Donovan Green, 60. Jamal Banks, 59. Keyshawn Williams, 40. Taylor Morin, 54. So to rank them by routes, it's Perry 1, Green 2, Banks 3. We go to the target volume. Well, it's so clearly Perry 1, but then you've got Green slightly ahead of Banks, 26 to 24, and then Keyshawn Williams and Morin right behind him. As far as price-adjusted plays, Donovan Green is my favorite behind A.T. Perry, just with the target volume there. The receiving yards are still there. He's only 11 yards behind Jamal Banks. I think he's the better price-adjusted play overall, but you can also punt with a Keyshawn Williams. Just know that they're not full-time players in the offense, but these Wake pass catchers always live. The one thing I'll say is in their last game, you saw their target leader, Perry, just 6 targets, nobody else more than 3. That's a risk when they're killing teams, and they're 21-point favorites against BC. Couple games left. We've got Purdue taking on Wisconsin. Not the best game environment, 51 total, 2.5-point spread in favor of Wisco. Purdue's fast. They're really pass heavy. Wisconsin's the exact opposite. O'Connell, he doesn't rush, so he's dependent on his 300-yard performances. He averages 45 attempts per game for 325 yards. Just, does Wisconsin prevent him from reaching that ceiling because of their slow play? They might. So O'Connell, he's cheap. He's stackable, but he's not a preferred play. Really easy to stack. Charlie Jones is banged up, but beat reporters expect him to play. He's got ridiculous target volume, 12 targets per game, 105 yards per game. Even though he's banged up, if he's out there, the volume's so good that you can play Jones. If he's not, actually Payne Durham, their tight end, has been their wide receiver too. 310 yards, 6.4 targets per game. He hasn't seen fewer than 5 targets in any of their last 4 games. However, they've mixed up their routes a little bit. So let's operate from the assumption first that Charlie Jones plays. Their second receiver is going to be Payne Durham, 91% route rate last week, but TJ Sheffield, 64%. And then we go down to Andrew Sawinski was at 54%, which was a big surprise for me. I don't even know who Andrew Sawinski is, but he was out there a lot. And Mershawn Rice at 30%. So Tyrone Tracy was essentially benched, 16% route rate for him. That was a bit surprising. Deion Burks at 11% too. Big surprise for Purdue there. I would think the most consistent guys that you're going to look at here are, it's probably TJ Sheffield, but it's really hard to say because he was at 55% the week before. If I'm ranking these guys, it's Payne Durham and Sheffield, and the rest are just pure GPP plays. Those names, again, are Mershawn Rice, Andrew Sawinski, and, I mean, maybe a Ramon Yassin. Probably not. The backfield, Devin Maccabee banged up as well, but B reporter saying he's going to start here. We saw the loss of Dylan Downing and the return of King Dover, but Maccabee handled 30 carries. No wonder the guy got banged up. 4 targets, 34 touches. Former walk-on, but he's been really good. Maybe not efficiency-wise, but just from a raw, like, handle the workload perspective, he's viable here, even though they're slight underdogs. Wisconsin's easy to evaluate. Graham Mertz, 202 yards on 24 attempts. They prefer to take the ball out of his hand, negative 12 rushing yards. But we've seen a couple big games from Chimere DK in the passing game, 69.5 receiving yards per game for him on 5.9 targets. He's been explosive. The problem is getting him the ball. But the one thing I'll say is Wisconsin had a couple guys transfer out of their program at receiver this week. No more Marcus Allen. So if anything, they can't rotate as much. The top 3 receivers are Chimere DK, Skylar Bell, and Keontez Lewis. Strongly prefer DK and Bell if you're playing anyone, which is not my preference. I would rather play Braylon Allen, who, without Ches Malusi, popped off for 33 touches, 29 carries. The guy was already efficient, averaging 108 yards per game, but now he's adding in that receiving role. They're favored over Purdue. Like Braylon Allen, he has, I think, the best raw volume on the slate. 7,400, he's playable. Memphis Tulane, 7-point spread, 56.5 total. Memphis is faster, 27th in pace, 50% pass rate. Tulane's defense is stalwart. They're impossible to play on right now. Beat Kansas State, played some really good teams already. Seth Hennigan has his hands full, but he does average 274 yards per game on 34 attempts, 176 rushing yards on the year. Is pretty good numbers for Hennigan. He's just GPP viable based on the volume, really. Impossible to stack. Memphis, they completely switched up their rotation at receiver. Previously, we'd seen their top 3 guys in no particular order be Javon Ivory, Eddie Lewis, and Gabriel Rogers. Well, Ivory returned his role, 74% route rate, but Lewis went down to 45% route rate, and Rogers went down to 32%. What happened? Joseph Skates jumped to 57%. Rock Taylor remained consistent. And the other guy that jumped, it was Joe Skates, and Kobe Drake jumped to 53%. Skates has played efficient football and limited opportunity this year, so I'm not surprised they started looking at him in a larger role, and it appears they're doing the same with Kobe Drake. So that's bad for Lewis and Rodgers in particular, and it probably just renders the only viable pass catchers Javon Ivory at this point and tight end Caden Prieskorn, who retained his 81% route rate. But Memphis, much, much harder to target now that we've had this rotation. Then in the backfield, like Brandon Thomas missed their last game, but I don't know how much that matters. If he comes back, it's a three-way timeshare. If he doesn't, it's a two-way timeshare between Jevion Ducker and Asa Martin. Ducker's the stone min, but I think I'd rather play Josh Williams from LSU. That's really tough to play a Memphis back, even Ducker at the stone min. Tulane, we've got Michael Pratt at quarterback. Not the pass-heaviest offense, not the fastest overall. They're 78th in plays per game, or excuse me, in seconds per play. That's their pace. Pratt, 196 rushing yards. That's solid numbers. 260 passing yards on 28 attempts. Those are really good for Pratt. Just like he needs to kind of be coaxed into those numbers. We saw against, a couple of his opponents where they'll just take their foot off the gas and ride the run. But Pratt, GPP viable. The best play for this team right now is Tyjae Spears, who they have thrust into a bell cow role. On the year, just 16.4 touches per game. In their last couple of games, he has seen a monster workload. 18 touches, 22 touches. One more game before that. Okay, let's just go through his last four. I'm going to read them from the fourth most recent to the most recent. 28 touches, 20 touches, 18 touches, 22 touches at 5,700 as a home favorite, plus a really good receiving role. Yeah, I'll take Tyjae Spears. In the receiving game, much harder to evaluate. They rotate about five guys. Number one in terms of routes is Shea Watts. Excuse me, Deuce Watts, not Shea White. Get those two confused sometimes. Deuce Watts has the most routes, but he's fourth on the team in targets. That's somewhat concerning here, but overall, nobody is above a 59% route share. That's Watts. Number two is Shea Wyatt at 55%. Then you've got Jaquan Jackson at 51, Dejon McDougald at 45. These got Tyreek James, their tight end, at 44%. They're all just flyers in tournaments based on big play volume, but Deuce Watts would be the guy I get to. Otherwise, probably Jaquan Jackson at 4,300, maybe even like Lawrence Key's also back from injury. He factors into the rotation now too. I'm just playing Spears. Last game, Arizona State, Stanford, 54 total, 3-point spread in favor of Stanford. Arizona State is slow, but they're very pass heavy, 54%. That's basically out of necessity. The one thing I don't like about this offense is they neutered Emory Jones, who formerly was an elite dual threat, but he's only got 14 rushing yards on the year. He doesn't have more than, okay, he has 5 design rush attempts in the last 4 games. Like, what the hell is going on with his usage? You can't play him right now. In the backfield, Xavier Valade is probably the only guy you can play. 18.7 touches per game, 94 rushing yards per game. Really good receiving role. Stanford's not great on defense. I don't know how Notre Dame didn't exploit this defense. They allow 5.8 yards per carry. Notre Dame couldn't run on him, but everyone else has been able to. Xavier Valade is in play. At receiver, Elijah Badgers, they're 1. You're just paying $7.2K for a guy averaging 6.8 targets and 61.5 yards. I don't see it. I'd rather play Giovanni Sanders at 3.1K, who's now seen 4.5 targets per game over the last 4, 40 receiving yards per game. I don't know who plays the 3. It's probably a mixture between Andre Johnson and Brian Thompson. Their routes have kind of ping-ponged around, so not great there. It's probably just Giovanni Sanders or Xavier Valade. For Stanford, Tanner McKee, I mean, this offense is fast, 38th in seconds per play, 51% pass rate. McKee is reliant on the volume, 257 yards on 32 attempts. He's not mobile, just negative 60 rushing yards, so he needs to be coaxed into a ceiling, which I question whether Arizona State can do. But you can go beyond him. Casey Filkins, holy smokes. This guy had 39 touches against Notre Dame. 39 touches. This guy has the best role at his price on the entire slate. He rivals Braylon Allen in terms of role. He's now a home favorite. Man, Casey Filkins, lock and load play. In the receiving room, they lost Michael Wilson. That sucks. He's their best playmaker by far. So who steps up? Well, their top 2 receivers are now Elijah Higgins and Benjamin Jurasik. Bryson Tremaine, I guess I should say they were top 3. Benjamin Jurasik's their tight end for what it's worth, but They're all pretty close. No one above 300 yards, no one below 200 in that group. I guess Jurasic's at 174, but they're all very consistent in routes. Jurasic's the stone min. I guess he's probably the preferred play for price adjusted, but Higgins would be the one at 44. And then John Humphrey should be their new 3. Didn't see a target last week. They just took their foot off the gas and ran the clock out against Notre Dame, but he'll play more. Also the stone min. I'd rather play Jurasic than him, though. But that's the slate. Monster slate, monster video. Thank you guys for watching. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Leave a thumbs up button if you haven't. I greatly appreciate it. It helps us continue to do what we do. And of course, if you do leave a comment, I'll make sure to get back to you. You can also reach out on Twitter. I'm at Matt_Kajeski there. More than happy to get back to you. But that's the breakdown for the slate. Good luck, everybody. We'll see you guys out there.